here for you. Ooh. And now here's your host, Erin Paige.
All interviews presented on the Remedy Revolution podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes which are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, please consult with your preferred medical provider. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Remedy Revolution podcast. My name is Erin, and I'm really excited to have this guest today. We've met in person, which was really exciting. I love meeting all my guests in person, and she has a very compelling story to share with you. Before I bring her on, I just want to remind you all, if you find value in what you are hearing here today, please like, share, subscribe, do whatever you can to get the word out. It really does make a huge difference for us here at the Remedy Revolution, and we would love to really expand our audience and get this message out to as many people as possible. So today's guest is somebody who has a very, very interesting story, something that I really hadn't considered previously, and was really struck by what had occurred for her in the realm of medical devices. I'm going to let her tell her story because I do think it's very important for you to hear it from her and her perspective. Thank you so much for being here, Frances Scott. It's a pleasure to have you.
Great to be here, Erin.
So, where did this all begin? Why did you start speaking out about medical devices? What was that journey like for you? Where did it begin?
Well, it began probably the year 2004 or 5. I started having hip pain for about 10 years. They kept telling me it was my back, and I'm like, but it hurts my bikini line. Like, I know that. So they kind of missed it for 10 years, kept saying it's your back, it's your back. And I was like, I think it's my hips. And they're like, but you're too young to have hip problems. I'm like, but I do. So I was in my early 30s. And finally, by my late 30s, somebody said, oh, oops, your labrum's torn up. Your hips are a mess. The only way to save them is have both hips replaced. And I was just 38 at the time. So you don't jump right into that if someone tells you that when you're that young. And so I started looking into it for about the next year. I was in severe pain by this point. And a couple of the doctors are like, well, we can buy you some time. They put me on narcotics. And I was like, I just need time because I can't just jump and do the surgery unless I'm sure I need it. And I had grown up reading medical journals. So, I wasn't really intimidated. I said, just give me some time to study. And so I sought opinions from 12 different doctors. 11 of them said, yes, your hips are a mess. The only way to get out of pain and get your life back is to have both hips replaced. And I had heard about, I had that done finally after a year of investigating, and I ended up in worse pain and with a whole new host of other issues, neurological, cardiac. My kidneys hurt all the time. My skin broke out in weird lesions, and I started having memory loss, tinnitus, insomnia. I would fall kind of like a Parkinson's patient. My hands would shake like a Parkinson's patient. But, I kept mentioning some of the things to my surgeon, and he was like, that's couldn't be from the hips. And eventually, I didn't mention a lot of the neurological symptoms because frankly, I was embarrassed. I was hallucinating, and my personality changed, mood, behavior, personality, all changed pretty dramatically. So I didn't necessarily mention those. For a while I thought, well, maybe it's these meds they have me on because they put me back on meds after surgery. And it finally took me years of investigating after the doctors had started just kind of shrugging every time, I sought help for 5 years, and eventually realized I need to do a deep dive of could it be the hips? Everybody kept saying, no, it couldn't be the hips, but all my symptoms had started right at the point I got the hips. So for a long time, I didn't believe what I was feeling myself, and just kind of figured, well, either I'm becoming schizophrenic, dementia, mental illness, or it is the hips. And when I heard some trials related to, it's not really class action, but these days we don't have class action like we think we do, and a lot of that changed in the 90s. But these days what we have is MDL. So 11,000 people I eventually found out had sued over my exact hip. And the first test cases were going forward in Dallas. And it's only, 3.5, 4 hours away from me. So I said to my husband, look, I got to know. You don't just get your hips replaced on a hunch. You have to be sure. But all my doctors and everyone I'd seen for, at that point, about 6 years was saying that it couldn't be the hips. causing my other issues. So I said, the doctors could be lying, the other patients could be lying, the device company could be lying, but the evidence won't lie. And I had been a reporter for 20 years before all this kind of cost me my career. And so I'd covered federal trials before, and I just drove up to Dallas, sat in on as many days as I could of the court proceedings. And that's where I learned the truth. And so I started, first I was devastated and shocked by what I learned in court, the evidence and the testimony. A lot of what was used to convince doctors and other patients that they were great products had been absolutely fraudulently conducted. And this was admitted in court, because as long as you tell the truth and don't perjure yourself, you're not going to personally face any penalty. And, your company will pay whatever fines or whatever happens with the verdicts. But you personally, as like a researcher or an executive, you won't face any personal jeopardy unless you just, don't lie on the stand. So I was pretty devastated that I had seen so much fraud, so much scientific fraud used to, promote the use of the products that had pretty much ruined my life. And so I started putting my story on YouTube. First, I wanted to find out if there were other patients out there. And that's kind of what led me to find out about the lawsuits and go to trial. And then once I went to trial, I thought, well, what about the poor woman up in Michigan who hasn't done well since she got her hip replaced? And she has no way to get to trial in Dallas and learn this. And, what was being covered in court was jaw-dropping. And as a newscaster, I was like, oh my gosh, people need to know about this. But I look around and there's nobody there from the New York Times or any other news institution. And then I thought, well, gosh, if the doctors don't realize they're being lied to in the medical journals, not every study, but at least these, I thought, well, what are the chances that I just stumbled into the one time that things were done this way? That's not likely. So from there, I started looking into other products, the Risperdal, the mesh, the breast implants, other drugs, Vioxx. I started really, just because I was curious if what I had seen in court related to the product that had hurt me might there be other products hurting other people. And that's kind of how I learned about the fact that medical devices don't have to be tested. 90% of new medical devices that come to the market never went through a single human clinical trial, according to a GAO report, I think from 2010. So, I saw some fraud. I was curious about how deep it went. I kept digging and saw way more than I ever could have imagined. I grew up with a surgeon in a medical house, and, I grew up reading medical journals just because it was the 80s and that's all we had laying around the house. There's no internet, no good TV. And so I was really upset that, that fraud is kind of like a marketing. It's, it's like now they're using the science, disguising it as real science, but actually it's just marketing disguised to look like ethically conducted science. So that's how I kind of got into all this.
Yeah. So you mentioned that your background was in journalism, and I do think that perhaps made you uniquely qualified to really do a deep dive into some of these things. But what was the most surprising thing that you found out upon your initial investigation? Something that kind of really knocked you off your seat and made you begin to, because obviously sounds like there was a certain point where you began really questioning all of these other things within, underneath the science umbrella. So what was it that really kind of rocked you to your core about that?
So after all the fraud about which I learned at the trials, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to fix this, and I'm going to go lobby in DC. And I went with a bunch of other women that were hurt by the eSure device. And I worked on a movie called The Bleeding Edge. It's a Netflix documentary. And because of that, I'd gone to, the shareholders meeting of the company that made my devices. I spoke, and they're like, yeah, we're going to get you some help. Come on down after the meeting. And then, the help was talk to your doctor and check out FDA.gov. So I was like, oh, okay. They're not really interested in helping people. The big first shocker was when I initially put my story out on YouTube, just saying, I have these bad hips. Does anybody else have them? Are y'all having these symptoms? And one woman reached out to me, and she had actually had my same surgeon, same hip. She only had one of them, but she had gotten them years before I did. And she said, get that stuff out of you. I don't care what anyone says. It was cobalt is the offending agent, cobalt ions coming off of the hip replacement devices getting into your bloodstream. She said, it's killing my heart and they can't stop the damage being done. So I don't care what they say to you, get that stuff out of you. That was the first, oh my goodness moment. Then eventually ended up going to speak to the FDA. It was November of 2019 and the committee investigating metals used in medical devices. And we all spoke and nothing happened. And then I learned that there had been another meeting back in 2012 in which a lot of people had gone forward saying, hey, these metals are hurting people. These devices are hurting people. So that point, that was another shock. I was like, you know what? They know about this. By then I learned about this doctor, Dr. Steve Tower in Alaska, who himself was poisoned by his metal hip with cobalt toxicity. He had very similar symptoms to mine. I learned about it in the Bleeding Edge, and he and I connected. And he had asked to be on the panel. So here he was, an orthopedic surgeon who wanted to be on the panel of, FDA panel investigating metals used in medical devices. He had experience not only from an orthopedic surgeon putting this stuff in people, but also he himself had personally been affected as a patient. And they said he's too conflicted. He's this small, like not a high volume orthopedic surgeon. And there was no reason to put him not on the panel when I looked up some of the people on the panel, heavily conflicted, heavily funded by medical device companies. And so that was another red flag. The third was when I went to speak at the at DC to go to lobby members of Congress and their staffers and tell them, hey, we need improved medical device safety. The response I got was pretty flat. And so at lunch, I spoke to somebody who had been a patient advocate for many years more than I had, Jack Mitchell. And he said, oh, yeah. I said, why are the people we're talking to today not shocked by what we're telling them? And he said, most of them already picked a side. Pharma funds both sides of a lot of the key elections so that no matter who wins, they supported the winner. And therefore, presumably something is owed back if you want to run for re-election. So I got home from that and I was pretty devastated. I thought, they've already bought everybody that could do anything about this. Since Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision in 2010, allowed essentially the corporations to buy their way into the pockets of many of our lawmakers. And at one point I looked up, and it was like 85-90% of lawmakers took a lot of money from pharma. And then I learned about how the FDA was essentially more funded by device company money or drug company money than it was taxpayers. Of the annual budget, more than 50% came from industry. And that was affecting how things, how we were not protected and how the interests of the industry were protected. So those were kind of my three big red flags. And I thought, okay, at this point, the only way we're ever going to get this fixed is if we inform. This has to be a grassroots thing. We have to inform people. Hey, the FDA is bought. The NIH is being run by the people that, some of these regulatory agencies are supposed to be governing. They're not. They're actually doing some of the marketing for these products, and they're looking the other way when patients come forward and say, hey, 20% of the population is allergic to nickel, and nickel's in a lot of these alloys. Shouldn't you first test patients before you implant this metal in their bodies permanently? Because once you get a product implanted that you're not doing well with, good luck finding a surgeon willing to touch you, because you're known at this point as a problematic patient with a problematic device. A lot of the people that I know who've had similar experiences as mine, you just kind of eventually get written off, and the doctor just says, oh, look, I don't know why you keep coming back. I've done my job for you. I can't help you anymore. So that's been pretty staggering too. The fact that when you do have a problem, so many of the doctors are on payroll with these drug and device companies as consultants. So, I knew that in the Clinton administration, payments to doctors, technically kickbacks, had been outlawed. What I didn't realize is all that money that the pharma industry used to use to incentivize the products, the drugs, when that became law and they could no longer just basically pay you per prescription, a lot of that money got redirected and they put doctors on payroll as consultants. You don't have to do anything per se. You're just a consultant for the industry. And to me, I know that people say, oh, the money doesn't affect me. But some of those payments that I saw, because a lot of it came out at trial, hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. And that's for an orthopedic surgeon, not for surgeries he's done, just to be a consultant for the device companies. So a lot of shocking things for someone who always believed in healthcare and medicine and the research, always thought it was ethically conducted. I was pretty devastated to learn that that was not the case.
Yeah, so I had an experience at a certain point where I was connected with somebody who worked for the medical device industry in spinal devices. And I always found it so strange because he was not a doctor. He had zero medical training. However, he was in the surgery room for many hours every day. And his job was to actually instruct the doctors and the surgeons how to do the surgery essentially with this particular device, which to me it just seemed very odd and uncomfortable, but I never knew enough to really, dive into it. And I didn't really feel comfortable and speaking to this particular person about this. But so what is that whole scenario? Because, when he wasn't in a surgery, he was often, golfing or traveling or, all of these kinds of things with these same doctors, which to me was, incredibly unethical. But maybe you could give me a little bit more insight. I know you alluded to some of it. So, what kinds of things are going on, particularly in the surgical rooms? And what kind of power do these consultants have over the surgeons themselves?
Well, I think the main, I haven't been in a room. I've had a couple friends be drug rep managers, or a couple people that I have relationships with have been in pharma, and they were kind of managing the marketing of a drug. So they managed drug reps. And so I knew a little bit about that. What I think they have is the doctor's trust, because you would think that if you're implanting this stuff in people, you would kind of make it your business to know everything about every alloy. I have since learned in the past 10 years, most surgeons aren't necessarily doing that. I've been to surgeons that, so a hip is 2 products, not one. So I had 2 hips, so a total of 4 products. And I knew the top part, the ball, the socket, and the liner were toxic. By the time I had done this investigation, spoken with all these whistleblowers, including other surgeons who raised their hands, other patients that had the same problem, I'm like, okay, I know the top part's bad, but is the bottom part bad? A product called the SROM, ROM, stands for range of motion. And I had a surgeon consider, the best in my city. Everybody referred me to this one surgeon. Oh, he'll know. And he said to me, Frances, I'm not going to do your revision because what's really poisoning you is that SROM product that goes down your femur. And getting that out is a huge deal. You'll never walk again, and I won't be a part of that. And he said, that's what's poisoning you with cobalt chromium. That we could see, we took blood work. I'd been getting blood work all along, and we saw the cobalt and chromium in my bloodstream rising. Well, come to find out, this is the best hip replacement surgeon in my town. The SROM isn't even made of cobalt chromium. I went back to that same surgeon with a friend of mine who needed a hip replacement to kind of be her advocate. This was, I think, before I had seen him. I sneaked in with her essentially, because once you have a bad product, or a product that has finally come to be known as bad, doctors a lot of times will cancel your request for an appointment. So you'll make a new patient appointment and they'll just call and cancel it and say he doesn't want to deal with you. He's not taking you as a patient. And I'm like, so a lot of people get stuck. They can't find anyone to help them. So, but anyway, a friend of mine said, well, I'm going to see him about a hip replacement. Why don't you come with me? Come sneak in, and then you can ask your questions, and you can get in front of this guy and he can see you're a real person. Maybe he'll agree to take you as a patient. And that's what happened. But in my meeting with her, in the consult with her, with the same physician, who later turns out didn't know what, this product in my body was made of, he told her I'd probably use this oxinium type hip, and he handed her a brochure. And because of my experience, she said, okay, good. And I'll get tested to make sure that I'm not allergic to the zirconia. And he said, why? And she said, well, because the thing's made out of zirconia. And he said, well, how did you know that? And she said, because it's in this brochure that you gave me. So eventually what I started understanding was the hip surgeons trust the device reps as the experts. The device reps trust the science. They have no way to know that what they're reading in the medical journals might not have been ethically conducted. When I was at trial, I learned that there's something called, I think it's called a 486 or a 586 letter. So when the FDA figures out that science has not been conducted in accordance with generally accepted, scientific principles, what's the penalty? Do they recall the journal? Does the journal send out a, hey, that study that we published turns out it wasn't good. The guy didn't do it the right way. No. He gets a letter from the FDA, and that's it. And then everything in the journals from then on that your doctor can pull and my doctor can pull, every research study, you have no way of knowing that it's fraud or it was, conducted fraudulently. Another thing I learned at the trial was in the case of this one researcher who was a consultant for the company that made my hips, he started a nonprofit, a 501c3. The company contributed to his nonprofit. The only people on the board of that nonprofit were this man, his wife, and one other person. So because I was in court, I saw the canceled check from Johnson & Johnson, the maker of my product, DePuy, to the Piedmont Foundation. The Piedmont Foundation, started by Dr. Thomas Schmalzried, a high-volume orthopedic surgeon, who then produces science, a study supporting the use of this cobalt chromium alloy and how to track the patients that have it, all this stuff. Well, if I hadn't been in court, I could never have seen. So when he produces work that says it was supported by the Piedmont Foundation, you really have no way of knowing who the Piedmont Foundation is. So you think it's completely unconflicted science with no financial conflicts of interest. Come to find out, only because I was in court, that the money used to produce that science was J&J money. And then he got a 1% cut of every Pinnacle hip sold. So I found that more and more often is that nonprofits are being used as kind of a reverse money laundering, for lack of a better term. They blur the lines between the industry selling the product and the science promoting the use of the product. So doctors think they're reading, unconflicted science. Oh, this thing has just been proven to be great, and cobalt has no effect on the human body till it reaches 300 parts per billion. They don't understand that study could have been funded by the company itself. In one case, I found that study I'm talking about, that cobalt didn't affect the human body until it reached 300 parts per billion. And I was at 4 parts per billion. I was out of my mind crazy, not doing well at all. My girlfriend that I connected with on YouTube, because she found my stuff, she was in absolute heart failure. She's now dead, and her cobalt was only 100 parts per billion. Another friend had 0.9, and she was having seizures, constant seizures, until she got all the hips removed and got it all out of her system. So I thought, when I saw that 300 parts per billion study, I was like, well, that seems really high. So I'm thinking, well, who is this guy? Is he another Dr. Schmalzried, another just industry shill? Come to find out, he was the guy that produced studies saying that secondhand smoke didn't cause cancer, that the chromium in the Hinckley, California, Erin Brockovich story, that chromium didn't cause those people's cancer. The asbestos in the Ford brakes didn't cause the Ford brake workers mesothelioma. And I learned there's a whole division of research. It's called the product defense industry. And it's their job to muddy the water so that when a doctor goes looking like, oh, is our breast implants bad or are these hips bad? They just have to have enough out there to confuse the doctors, to muddy the water. I learned that from a book by David Michaels, who used to be with OSHA. It's called Doubt is Their Product. And then his second book is called The Triumph of Doubt. Those two books taught me about the product defense industry, which is essentially, we do research that says whatever you need it to say.
So that being said, what are the clinical trials like for these medical devices, or are there any?
Well, devices are division. I'm not an expert on this, I have to say. I kind of just blew off this part of it. But most devices are not tested according to that 2010, I think it was General Accountability Office study. Congress commissioned a study, look into our medical devices. The GAO came back and said 90% of all new medical devices on the market were never tested in a single human before they were sold. My hips, never tested in human. They were tested on robots in jars of water. That's because of something I consider a loophole. It's called 510K. It's a division of the law that governs how medical devices are tested. And everything except I think what's considered class 3 devices, which are like the defibrillators and the pacemakers. Everything else doesn't have to be tested as long as the device company will say, well, this is so much like some predicate device, some earlier device that's been on the market before, that we shouldn't have to test it in human clinical trials. It allows them to skip human clinical trials. So they will not tell the first patients who get it, or I was never told, hey, by the way, this thing got to market through the 510K pathway. Essentially, there's a difference between FDA approved. That means a product went through the pre-market, what we think of as the gold standard, lots of human clinical trials and lots of follow-up and rigorous science. Most medical devices are cleared, FDA cleared, which means they've gotten to market using this 510K pathway. They weren't tested on any humans before they were sold. They could be tested in cadavers. They could be tested on robots. They could be in silico testing, which means just a computer. We did some modeling. But, my thing was robots don't have nerves. We can see the wear debris on the ball and the socket, but that doesn't tell you what comes off that hip, how it affects the human body. So my hips had been on the market more than 10 years, and I was stunned to learn they were never tested on humans. And a lot of doctors have never heard of 510K. They don't understand this. What I eventually learned was, when you're a company and you're submitting this new product that's never been tested on humans, living humans in clinical trials, you submit this 510K form and you say, here are the predicate devices that we're using to say it's like a statistical equivalent to something previously on the market. Those devices they're listing could have been a train wreck. They could have been recalled, which most things aren't recalled. Most bad products get just silently, they call it a silent recall. They just take it off the market. And so, very few things get recalled, where they'll then cover your revision surgeries and things like that. My product was just quietly taken off the market. My product, I had learned about this other product called the ASR hip, and I knew it was a train wreck because it actually had been recalled. And one of my doctors had kind of told me about it as a news tip. And so I learned, this ASR is bad. But yet when I talked to different surgeons about it, my surgeon included, he said, it's the pinnacle. What I'm going to give you is nothing like the ASR. Well, come to find out, the ASR, the only reason it was on the market is because DePuy had claimed that it was the statistical equivalent to the pinnacle. Yet when they recalled the ASR, they said, oh no, they're nothing alike. But when they wanted to get the ASR on the market, they're the statistical equivalent. So if you recall the ASR, it seems like they're the statistical equivalent, right? You should recall. No. So it's a daisy chain of failed devices. And that's why I usually tell people, if you ever want to get a medical device, make sure you get something that's more than 15 years old, because it takes about that long for the doctors to finally decide, oh yeah, these things really are bad. Like it'll be at least 10 years before the surgeons start going, yeah, I just never have good luck with that. And then they stop ordering it. And then the device company pulls it from the market claiming poor demand. Yeah, poor demand because everybody's finally figured out that the thing is a train wreck.
So I have a little bit of a personal story here. So my father received a hip replacement. During that surgery, the surgeon actually changed the device that he was going to be using. And so to be honest, I don't know. My father simply trusted his doctors, as I'm sure many people do, but I don't think he has any idea what kind of device he even had. So how do we go about figuring that out and understanding? Because at this point, in my opinion, it did not improve his health whatsoever. In fact, he's been complaining of pain going down his leg since the surgery, and which has been a few years now, and he can barely walk. So how do we go about researching what device he has and if it's something that could be affecting him in a negative fashion?
Well, I would first say you go to the hospital where he had the surgery, not to the doctor. A lot of people go to the doctor and they say, what kind of hip do I have? And he says, titanium. And that's it. No. You need to know. Think of it like Ford Bronco. You need a make and a model. Mm-hmm. Then what were the options on that Bronco? Did it have this package, that package? I got the DePuy Pinnacle. That was just the top part. Again, there's a second product, which is the stem. Usually most hips are made up of two products. So you call the hospital, you request operative notes, say, I want my dad's notes from this day of the surgery. In those notes, now granted, I had my surgery in 2011 before 2013 and all the requirements for digital record keeping that came with the Affordable Care Act. Now everything's digital, but in my day, there on every box of a product that was going in a patient, there were two stickers. One went in the patient's notes. So in my notes, my operative notes, not in the notes the doctor has at his office, but in the hospital, the operative notes you get there were UPC, almost like little barcodes for every product I had. You need the notes, the operative notes, and then you need to look at every single product. And then from there, it's kind of hard to figure out what the thing's made of. An easy test, it's usually covered, the serum cobalt, serum chromium tests. Those are covered. Those your GP can order. And, that'll at least let you know. In the case with my hips, it was a metal ball and a metal socket. Well, the device industry says, oh, we stopped selling those in 2016, or I think it was 2013. It was June of 2013. Basically, the FDA said, because we know we didn't require any pre-market clinical trials on humans, why don't you go ahead and turn over what you've learned since you have started selling these things? And all the device companies said, we're good. We'll just stop selling them. Low demand. So it is hard to figure out. There's something called the FDA's MAUDE database, MAUDE, very hard to find reports. That's where you're supposed to go. Like VAERS is for vaccine, MAUDE is for these medical devices, and almost impossible to figure out, is this device bad or good? And I think that could be by design. The FDA started allowing, I forgot what they call it now. I should have refreshed my notes, but summary submissions. They allowed basically hundreds, thousands of adverse event reports to be submitted as one report. So that makes it really hard. And that's kind of my argument, is that the regulatory agencies like the FDA and the way they do things, the fact that we don't have a registry for devices, nobody's looking to see what devices are failing except the device companies. And they can disclose it, but the FDA allows them to disclose it in a way that kind of makes it impossible for average citizens to just figure out what's wrong with, is this a bad product or good? How many adverse events were there? It's really hard to search the MAUDE database. So that's been a trouble. I too have seen, because I put my store online and then I reported online about the hips, I became like this de facto. People would just reach out to me because they can't talk to anybody about it. They feel like the product is causing a problem in them. They get denied. Some people are allergic to nickel, which is it's in this cobalt chromium alloy. And they're told medical allergies are not a thing, or they're so rare that, they don't get tested prior to putting one of these in them. Even when they go back after and they say, I'm having trouble with this knee, and I think I'm allergic to it. It's constantly inflamed. My bone won't grow into it. All this fluid. I keep having infections, like all these signs around the implant. And that's when the doctor kind of, wipes his hands. You're a problem patient. And so these people would reach out to me and I'd say, well, what kind of device do you have? Well, we don't know. Okay, here's how you go find out. And then they'd call me back and they'd be like, I have the blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, can I see your records? I know doctors who want to help patients with this, but they're afraid. I have a friend whose husband got one of these metal hips. She saw him decline. She realized it's a problem, started digging into it, wanted to set up a nonprofit where she could kind of advise them. But the attorneys all told her, this would potentially jeopardize your medical license. So I became a person who could actually talk through more with patients because I'd lived it. And so I'm like, this is the test. Get an FDG PET scan of your brain. Get an echocardiogram of your heart. I learned that from Dr. Tower, who was the surgeon in Alaska who got poisoned by his hip. And so I got to see a lot of, x-rays and operative notes from people. One man called me. He was I think it was North Dakota. And I didn't keep track of this because, I'm just taking calls, trying to help as I can. I'm like, hey, I'm not a medical doctor, but here's what I've learned in case it helps you. This one guy, he said he was like 260 pounds. He's a big old farmer from the Midwest. Again, I think it was North Dakota. And he said, I saw his, stickers, and he had a very small implant. And I remembered back to trial and how the my device company, had been informing its device reps, hey, SWAT, SWAT, sell what's available today. So it's like, whatever inventory you have, figure out how to convince the doctor that that's what he should use for that patient that's on the table. So this guy in North Dakota, this farmer guy, he had the hip break, literally the stem like cracked into, you could see it on an x-ray. It looked horrific. And so when I looked at the implant, the piece that goes down the femur, it was like a size extra small. And I'm like, now how tall are you? Oh, I'm 6'8", 260. And I'm like, you had a really small device, really small hip put in your body. And I'm not saying that's why it cracked, but that's a lot of force. And it was just a little, compared to what was going down my femoral, cavity, down my femurs, his looked like a toothpick. And he said, I went in when I went in to get these things, I went in on the day I was supposed to have surgery, and I actually had to wait 24 hours because they're like, hey, we don't have anything that'll fit you. And so I eventually got surgery the next day, and I'm like, he said, we had to wait for them to bring the hip. And I'm like, I wonder if they did bring you another hip, because what they ended up putting in you was way too small, in my layman's opinion. So I've had another friend who got her hip removed, explanted device, right? So then she was told she had one hip. And then when it came out, turns out what they pulled out of her, what a different doctor pulled out of her, was not the product listed in her medical records. So I'm seeing a lot of that. Like, a lot of you thought you had ceramic, but really you had cobalt chromium. This one particular lady, she thought she had ceramic, but when the next revision surgeon pulled it out of her, it was all scratched up. You could see it was a coating on a metal ball. So why that matters is, like, my hips, the metal, quote unquote, metal on metal, the device companies all say, oh, we've solved that problem because we took metal on metal hips off the market when the FDA wanted us to turn over our data, our post-market surveillance of them. And when I had my explanted devices analyzed by Dartmouth, the Thayer School of Engineering analyzes medical devices, kind of tells you where the wear was. What Dartmouth told me was, you had corrosion evidence. So I was in so much pain because I was allergic to the nickel in the hip too, I believe. Secondarily, cobalt's toxic to the heart, and now we're starting to see to the brain too. We've known that about the heart for years and years, decades, well established in the medical journals, because all these people drank beer that had cobalt as an additive, and that's how they figured out, oh, it kills the heart. So, but I was in so much pain, I think because I was allergic to the nickel in the implant, that I really didn't walk a lot. I wasn't like my friend who had the heart failure from it. She never knew she had a problem because she wasn't allergic to nickel. So she was like losing weight and, 10 years of just thinking the thing was great until she found out it was killing her heart. Me, I didn't move around much. So what normally they say is the cause of the metal getting into your bloodstream is this wear debris, where, metal ball rubs on metal socket. My problem was coming from corrosion. The stem, where the titanium neck of the stem fits into the back of the cobalt chromium ball, two dissimilar metals in a wet environment. Everybody knows, but me, the English major, didn't know that increases corrosion. So plus, if you're allergic to your implant, the tissue around the implant becomes more inflamed. Inflamed tissue is more acidic than non-inflamed tissue, speeds up the corrosion rate. So number one, a lot of people, nobody knows what they're getting. Sometimes doctors change. I tell people now, if you're going to get a hip, you find out exactly what hip he's going to use in you, and you tell him you only will allow that hip to be put in you, because you're going to do research on it ahead of time to make sure it's not one of these problematic ones, or ones that are starting to be known as problematic. I tell people, you want the oldest, you want the tried and true, not the latest and the greatest, because most aren't tested prior to hitting the market. You need the one that survived the long enough that your surgeon's comfortable using. So, and then in some cases, what I saw in the trial was there was one product that had been pulled off the market. I'm not sure of this. I haven't seen evidence, but a couple of my girlfriends and I that all look into this feel like when a device gets recalled, do the companies just eat the expense of that product? The thing's already been made. Or do you sell it to a different company that then renames it, repackages it, and calls it a different product and sells it to the hospitals? Additionally, you can look on eBay and find a wrapped product marked sterile, ready to go. There is nothing that tells you that it was bought off eBay. When you see the listing on eBay for a hip replacement device, it says this device is only for use in veterinary. It's not for use in humans. And we're going to make sure you have to be a medical provider to buy this off of us. And we're going to double check before we send it to you that you are. I've bought 3 for $25 off eBay. And then, when I look at my bills and it's like $77,000 to buy 2 balls and 2 sockets, which is what I had revised. My insurance company got charged $77,000. I'm finding hip replacement products on eBay for $25. Like, that's great. Like, if I was a bad dude and I could buy it for $25 and put it in you and charge your insurance $77,000, but I didn't have to pay, tens of thousands of dollars for the product. That's a pretty good, there's been a hospital in California that was using parts from a machine shop down the street, implanting screws. And so these poor people, I know one of the girls that has this hardware in her neck, and she's like, I don't even have any idea what it is because what's in me came from a machine shop down the street. That story made the news. A lot of these don't, because a lot of the drug device companies are major funders of, they spend a lot of money on advertising. Obviously, you could see every other ad as a drug ad. So it's terrifying. I discourage people as not some uncomfortable hip pain. Don't run out and get any sort of implant if possible, because it's really buyer beware. Like, we think the FDA is protecting us, and it's really not.
So I can definitely see how, from the device industry, how this is profit driven primarily. And additionally, there's very little with regard to checks and balances. So not a whole lot of oversight with regard to the FDA and all of these other industries, or 3-letter agencies, if you will. But at this point, once you bring it to the attention of the surgeons themselves, I presume that particularly in an industry where many of these surgeons are doing what they believe are life-saving surgeries, getting people out of pain, helping people recuperate after a horrific accident, things like that, and implanting these devices. But is there any accountability from the surgeons themselves with regard to some of these implants that are really harming people?
So you mean, do the patients ever sue the doctor directly? Be
Well,
like, you should have known, you should have,
I guess yes, but also, do the doctors themselves ever start to understand and recognize that some of these devices, maybe they themselves have been misled on what the actual device is doing in their patients?
Yeah. And that's what I found, is that everyone's just trusting. Everybody's trusting in the system. No one understands yet how radically the system has changed. No one understands, and they don't have any reason, like what I learned at trial was horrific. And if I had been an orthopedic surgeon, to see what I saw at trial, 2 different trials, bellwether trials related to my exact hip product, jaw dropping. What surgeon's going to have 4 months to go sit in on 2 trials? Like, that's just never going to happen. And even as a reporter, like a former reporter, the New York Times even is not going to budget for Barry Meyer, a reporter who did report on the ASR fiasco, for him to come sit in Dallas for 4 months twice to learn the truth. So as I view it now, the doctors don't understand they're being lied to sometimes in the medical journals. And even Marcia Engel used to be an editor for over a decade of one of the major medical journals. And even she wrote a book in, I think it was 2011. And in it, she said, 50% of what gets published in medical journals, you can't trust. So, I don't even know if the doctors understand this yet. And I don't think, just like my family members, like, we've always just trusted doctors. I was raised by a doctor. He loved his patients. Well, what a lot of people don't realize yet is, with Affordable Care Act and the digital record keeping requirement, that required a lot of doctors to literally have to spend $100,000, maybe a little more, on extra staff to keep up with compliance of that digital record keeping and all the laws. So even the doctors that wanted to be holdouts and be like the small mom and pop, kind of what dentistry is today, like that's what doctors used to be, until it's been a gradual, like the corporatization of physician practices. It just becomes like doctors they don't like business. They don't want to do a lot of the things that you have to do when, the good ones are just about the patients. But they've found it's just too expensive. You're getting out of school with $300,000 in medical school bills. And it's like, well, you could just join a managed care practice, get paid a couple $100,000 a year, and not have to deal with all that. But what it did was our doctors have bosses now, and the bosses are working for publicly traded companies, and their fiduciary duty is to the shareholders. So that's when we started noticing, I think in the late 90s to early aughts, these like 5-minute appointments you had with physicians. And so like no one told my stepdad how long to spend with any patient. And he would spend an hour with you his patients knew that. So they waited forever to see him. But that really doesn't happen anymore unless you go with like concierge medicine, where they don't take insurance and it's just you and the doctor. And so it's basically rich people medicine. The rest of us are all, doing this managed care thing. And our doctors have bosses in the way that they were their own bosses in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, most of them are owned.
So it feels very much like the David and Goliath kind of undertaking. And so in your mind, with all the knowledge that you have amassed over the last several years, what is the way out of it? Because obviously educating the patients to go and speak to their doctors in an informed manner to understand the dangers and the risks of these medical devices is key, but also allowing for the openness of the doctors to actually hear those patients is such a huge part of that picture. So what in your mind is the best way to go about the education piece with regard to not only the patients, but the surgeons themselves?
That's so hard. And I didn't go to med school, and I was raised to really respect. I saw what my stepbrother went through trying to become a trauma surgeon. And then eventually, he's gotten into the administration side too of emergency rooms. It is extremely hard. And I did not have, at the time I was going through this, I didn't have that chutzpah, that like, no, this thing is bad. You need. So the hard part about that is that a lot of the doctors might not understand that they have any reason to doubt what they're being told in the medical journals. I mean, you can't see till you see it. And like the reason I learned that is because I was sitting in on a, trial, 2 different trials. And then I look around and I think, well, no doctor would have. The only reason I had all that time to go do that is because I had lost everything, because I lost my health. So I didn't have a job anymore. I had nothing to do, literally. And I couldn't walk very well or stand for very long at a time, but I could sit and I could take notes. And I just realized, there were no other reporters in there, and they had, nobody was reporting on this. And then also, like I said, I think earlier, when a study is done incorrectly, nothing ever goes back out. Like in news, as a journalist, we'd say, oh, we have to make a correction or a clarification. I don't see very often that that's done. The FDA sends the researcher a letter saying you did this incorrectly. Nobody else is informed. The stuff is not usually taken out of a medical journal. So the doctors have no reason to know that they're being lied to in the medical journals. Then secondarily, they are trusting the device reps to be the expert on the actual device. Usually they're the experts on the technique and the surgery and patient management. But, when it comes to the device, they're like, well, the FDA handles that, right? They don't understand about 510K. So it becomes very hard to get this information across to a doctor. I saw a surgeon here when I was looking for somebody to revise me. He didn't want to revise me. He was like, they just treat you like you're insane. And I got kind of mad because I wanted him to order the FDG PET scan and the echocardiogram of my heart, because I had learned from my experience with other people who knew more about this than I did, or this doctor did. Those were some tests I needed, and he wouldn't order them. And I got kind of mad. So a couple of days later, I got a call from his PA, and he said, look, I'm a fellow here. I know, the doctor told me to call you because he knew that you were irritated. And I just want to kind of spend some time explaining to you why he didn't want to order those tests. And so we ended up in this hour-long conversation. And, I explained why I wanted the test and what I knew. And finally he said, Frances, I'm sad to admit this, but you know more about these issues than I'd say 99% of people in medicine. Because again, they don't know that they can't trust what they're reading. And they haven't done a deep dive into user fees and 510K and, Citizens United. And, so like everybody's going along just trusting in these systems that maybe used to be, I think the FDA originally, we think about the lady, her name was Frances, at the FDA who blocked thalidomide from coming into this country. We think that still happens. And I'm finding that's not the case. So it does become very hard to convince your doctor to look into this. Plus, if his boss is telling him he has to see X number of patients a day, that doesn't lend itself to 2-hour discussions with the doctor. So a lot of times, I've just found that if they weren't open to it and they didn't want to dig and they weren't interested in what I had to say, I just had to cut ties and move on. And usually I got to the point where I didn't even go see a doctor unless I knew that he knew that this was an issue and would talk about it honestly. And then I could go look him up on, if you search ProPublica dollars for doctors, there was a provision in the Affordable Care Act for a while that said doctors had to disclose from whom they get paid and for what reasons. So from about 2013 or 2014 to 2018, I think when the teeth got kind of legislatively ripped out of the Affordable Care Act, you could find out who was paying your doctor. Now, again, who was policing that? What's the penalty for not disclosing that you got money from this company or that? I think it was all on the honor system. So, take that with a grain of salt. So it was essentially, we're all just self-reporting like the device companies, if we're doctors and we're taking money from industry. But for a while, you could look and see who he's getting money from. And I advised people for a long time to look up your doctor and find out, because it matters. Who's paying you? It matters. No one's paying me to say this. So, and the doctors aren't walking around with big patches like NASCAR drivers saying like Pfizer or whoever it is that they're taking money from. But a lot of that went away. You can't find out anymore from whom. So you can't really figure out who your doctor's allegiant to. I always say, what my stepdad used to say, the best doctors listen to and learn from their patients. And the best ones I've found, even though I didn't go to med school, I might know something that they don't know. And there are a few that listen. And so I felt like there's not really a way to fix this until more people, more of the population wakes up and sees that it's happening. And unfortunately, that is happening because the more people that are hurt by products they thought were safe, the more people start digging into this. And the more, I'm just one little drop. I'm one raindrop, but there are a lot more of us. And we're all, I tell people, like, we've kind of lost the news as far as completely unbiased working for the viewers. They don't work for the viewers and the readers anymore. They've kind of turned the viewers and the readers into the product that then they sell to the real customer, which is, the drug company that's running the ads. So we have to be the news now. We have to tell our stories as often as we can. Write it, tell it, put it out on YouTube censors, but, find other places. Like, the more of us tell our stories, we become individual drops, but soon it's a hurricane. And I think, unfortunately, until there's so many of us who've been hurt by these products that we trusted, it will be undeniable. But that may take years. And how many people get hurt in the meantime?
Well, and we've seen that very clearly with the pharmaceutical industry, just with the Sackler family as one example of what the opioid crisis did for so many, people and damaged so many lives, not just the people who were taking OxyContin, but people that were directly impacted, for, people that had been in, accidents with these collisions with these other people who had been taking, who were under the influence at the time. So just as one very small example, but I think it did take, unfortunately, that mountain of evidence to really get to the heart of what was going on, and really a dedicated group of people who had been affected and afflicted by the financial interests of the Sackler family.
You know, What's funny is that book was written, or Dope Sick was
Yeah.
written. Beth Macy and Barry Meyer at the New York Times both did a lot of great reporting that became movies. Painkiller or Painkillers by Pete Berg, and then Dope Sick was on Hulu. And ironically, that's where I started. The Appalachian region, the Roanoke Valley, is where Beth Macy is, and she was reporting for the Roanoke Times when I had my first job at Roanoke TV stations. And I knew John Brownlee. He married my station's TV news anchor. So I knew him. He was one prosecutor, the U.S. attorney who tried to, I think, get prosecutions. What I learned from Dope Sick and the Painkiller movie, I didn't read Barry Meyer's book, but I read Dope Sick. What I learned was the Sacklers didn't do anything that every other drug company isn't doing. It's just this, I mean, as big as Purdue Pharma was, from what I've seen, the DOJ and even the SEC, they go after the little fish. The penalty for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which just says, basically we're not, even though other countries bribe, American companies are not going to bribe to get, let's say in the Greek medical system or whatever, to have their products featured. Well, some of the laws that I've seen these companies blatantly, in court, it comes out that they have violated what I consider RICO violations, racketeering, organized crime. Like that's what I see this as. And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, doing things and getting caught for doing things like bribing other governments to get their products preferential treatment. Well, these companies, even the big ones, sometimes you'll see a big, verdict against. I'm not talking in civil court. I'm talking criminal.
Sure.
But the penalty, if you do the things that I know pharma companies are doing, especially the big boys, the penalty is those companies are supposed to never be allowed to participate in CMS again, which means any hospital that treats Medicare, Medicaid, VA patients. Like if you're a drug company and you get caught breaking these laws, the penalty on you is lifetime ban from CMS, which means never again, let's say it was J&J, never again could a J&J product be used in a hospital that treats Medicare or Medicaid patients. Our hospitals couldn't run without J&J products. Ethicon, Mentors, the breast implant company. DePuy is its subsidiary that does medical devices. So some of these companies are too big, what I call too big to jail. It's not they're too big to fail. They're not going to fail. They're making plenty. You can't even go after them because they're part of our fabric of our healthcare system. And so people need to understand, just because we don't see a movie being made about what J&J or Pfizer or any of the other drug companies are doing, everything you saw the Sacklers do, I have seen evidence of other drug companies doing it. It's just they're too big. I believe the DOJ was trying to make an example of the Sacklers, and that's why there was any attempt at a criminal prosecution. But that's how all the drug companies are doing it. It's just the big boys don't get prosecuted in the same way that the little guys do.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I've had Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Peter McCullough on. We've spoken quite a bit about corruption within the medical community, the scientific community, really. And the fact of the matter is, so many doctors in clinical practice, they just don't have the time and the energy to pore over all of these journals. And so they might read an abstract and, think that they're doing their due diligence. But unfortunately, you really can't just read the abstract anymore. You really have to dive deep into the data and understand what is behind that data, both from a scientific perspective, but also from a financial perspective. Many of the journals themselves, for example, are funded by pharma. And so a journal that's funded by, Johnson and Johnson is not likely to publish something that is going to be, damaging to one of their major flagship products. It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. So I think that's so so interesting that you bring up that whole fabric of, the fact that so many of these hospitals and doctors are really getting paychecks directly from industry. And so it requires an entire shift and dismantling of that entire system in order to then enact some kind of change within the industry itself.
And
Well,
that's part of the reason I went to work for the Kennedy Beacon, which is a Substack that is funded by the Political Action Committee, trying to get Robert F. Kennedy elected president, because I found Kennedy through this. He's the only one saying, like, I had already seen it, and then I found him, and he's saying it, and helping people understand what's going on. It's essentially industry capture of our regulatory agents and agencies. And that's why I was like, that's the only person paying me right now is the American Values 2024. It's because I can't go back to normal news. A lot of people say, well, are you medical? You know so much. Why don't you go work for? And I'm like, I can't do it because now I know the science behind it is not always something upon which we can depend. So, Kennedy's the only candidate I've heard so far saying, and I don't want to get political, but he's saying the first thing I'm going to do is go to these medical journals and say, straighten up or you're done. I'm going after you with RICO law. Like I'm going after you for organized crime, essentially. And I think that's what has to happen. People, it wasn't all of J&J that knew the hips were bad and that they were going to hurt people. It was just from what I learned at trial, it was just about half a dozen people at the very top who, in their mind, they're just taking one word out of a study. Let's just drop the word shell from the title, make it look like the pinnacle hip is still in place at 5 years post-op in 99.9% of patients, when the truth was the study only looked at, is the shell still in place? Well, the shell almost never gets taken out in a revision. It's always just the liner and the ball. So, it was just a couple people doing a couple things that just a little bit deceptive, but people who used to deceive like that, and it hurt a lot of people, they could, in the past, agencies could, or Justice Department, the DOJ, could go after and personally prosecute those people until executives at these companies start facing personal prison sentences, not just, the company paid the fine and it looked like it all went away and it got better and the shareholders are appeased, until people start being taken to prison for what they did. And that hasn't happened in decades. This is never going to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Because the money's too good. I had one person say, because I was looking into this and trying to start writing about it and working on a book about it. And I remember one quote is, it's hard to do the right thing when you're making so much bleeping money doing the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
Just,
mm-hmm.
There's no incentive to not do the wrong thing.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think accountability is so key. And, it's one of the reasons that a true capitalistic society works, because we have a meritocracy and we have accountability,
Market forces, yeah.
Exactly.
But we don't have an actual free capitalist society.
Right.
We have this crony capitalism, and that's where I see the regulators are essentially a way to box out a smaller good company from coming in and doing the right thing. I mean, it's really seems to me about like market control, because there's so many hoops that only the big boys can jump through to get their products on the market but my concern is it's the appearance, in the wild, wild west, we would have known, that might be snake oil, I better not take it. But what we have now is the appearance of regulation without the actual regulation, which is worse than no regulation at all, because we, the patients, don't know, the doctors don't even know that we need to be doing extra research. But in defense of, what should be happening is the doctor should know, my patient might know something I don't know, and I should at least listen to her. And that's what I see not happening. And it could be because of, working for a corporation and only having allotted like 5 minutes, to actually spend time with the patient, because so much of your job is record keeping now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do find a certain arrogance within a lot of the medical community, and I don't know if that's, educated into, or if it's more of a result of cultural norms and people
There's an authority. If you spent 10 years becoming a specialist, it's going to take a lot for anybody to tell you you don't know what you know. And
Right.
when my mom married my stepdad when I was 10, and he was an angel, but he also could be pretty sharp. And like a couple times I get my feelings hurt, and she'd say, well, I mean, he's a surgeon, so like when he needs something done, he needs to bark and people jump, and that could save lives. It could be a matter of life and death if you don't have that sort of authority in your voice, and also like believing in what you pretty sure so it sets it up to where, especially female patients, they can be written off as hysterical. Well, frankly, when you're in chronic pain and you never sleep and you have all these weird symptoms, it could make you hysterical. Same thing with having a child with an issue that nobody could figure out. Like, you're going to get pretty heated because it's affecting your entire life. The doctor should know that and take that into consideration. And, of course she's upset. She hasn't slept in 3 months or whatever. Of course she's upset because you're not hearing her, and she's got a kid who's freaking out or whatever the problem is. So, I just wish doctors would actually listen to their patients. And some do, but it's not, I'd say like 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20, maybe.
Well, I do think the tides have been turning, and I do think that that is in part because of stories like yours, and because, as I always say, mine and your inability to shut up. So,
Yeah.
ultimately, it can serve us well when we are able to tell those stories with courage and without feeling like we need to suppress or hide how we're feeling physically. And I think there's definitely room for warrior women out there who are willing to break the mold and tell the story anyway, regardless of the pushback that they're going to get.
There
So
was
I
one
applaud
guy,
you.
thank you. There was one guy that reached out to me. A lot of people did, because they found my stuff on YouTube, and they all had these things. And one guy said, I had that bad hip. He called me. I'll take anybody's call. And he said, I had that bad hip. He's like, but I got it taken out. And and I said, when? And he said, about a year after you put it in. I was like, a year? I tried for 6 years to even to know if anything was wrong, and then another 2 years until I could find someone to take it out of me. I said, how'd you get it out so fast? I just went in there. I told him something was wrong. I said, take this thing out of me. I was like, if I had had that much self-assuredness, it would have saved my family 8 years of suffering, my entire family, because the family suffered. When the mom's not right, the whole family suffers. And I just want to encourage women, and I say this to my kids all the time now: believe yourself. If you feel like something's wrong, you keep digging, you keep insisting. I caused so much extra pain in my family because I didn't trust myself for 8 years, and that's my biggest regret, is that I didn't, I had to have it slap me in the face so many times. I had such ingrained trust in medicine, in healthcare, in the journals, in research, and everything, and in the goodness of people, because I truly think most people, don't want to hurt people for money. That it really caused my family a lot of extra suffering, is that I didn't trust myself. I didn't believe what even I was feeling. And I deferred to the guys in the white coats. So the programming's strong. I mean, we're trained to be obedient and do what we're told. And having grown up in a medical family that were with a doctor that actually did care about people, that kind of hurt me.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share your story. We are now at that point in the podcast where I ask every single one of our guests 8 rapid fire questions. These are designed for us to have a little bit of fun, get away from some of the heaviness of some of these conversations, and really spread some good in the world. Frances, are you ready?
Sure.
All right. Number 1, if you could choose only one natural remedy for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Sunshine.
Awesome. Tell us something most people don't know about you.
I have a deep-seated love for rodents, especially guinea pigs, after all this. And I found the art of espalier, which is like training flowers to be in one plane. That's, if you're a gardener and you have hip pain, you can do that on a stool.
Awesome. If I were to compile a playlist of happy music, what song would you suggest be added?
I mean, I really love George Michael, Freedom.
Nice.
Any Beastie Boys, probably.
What is your favorite guilty pleasure?
Peeps. So embarrassed ever since I was little. I was like, there are marshmallows covered in sugar. God. I mean, how could I ever say I care about my health? But every now and then.
That's funny. That's one of those things you either love them or hate them, I feel
I
like.
mean, they're gross. Like, I can't even believe I would admit most of the time we eat about 15 apples a day. My family, like, we eat real food, but like sometimes I just need a peep.
It's all right. Everything in moderation, right?
I think just because they're fun too. Like, this is ridiculous. Like,
all right. What is the most influential book you've ever read?
that'd be I mean, the War on Ivermectin was awesome. That's the recent, but the tried and true is probably Man's Search for Meaning, and how our, we can only control what our processing and our response to things.
Absolutely. And what does the word revolution mean to you?
I would say, gosh, I've never thought about that one. I mean, because there can be revolutions both in a good way and a bad way. I mean, I'd say it's something that's needed now. What does it mean to me? I don't know. I would just say it probably that we need to remember that revolutions can happen quickly or they can happen slowly and silently.
Yeah, absolutely. And what does the word remedy mean to you?
It means healing, the fix of true healing.
And lastly, if you could impart one piece of wisdom onto our listeners, what would that be?
Trust yourself. Believe in your ability to learn. Just because you didn't go to medical school doesn't mean you can't read and learn things. Be your own advocate, because my son's learning this right now with some kind of mystery stuff going on with him. And I'm like, dude, you really have to be the one to figure it out yourself.
Absolutely. Well, Frances, it has been a pleasure. Where can people learn a little bit more about your story, or how to advocate for themselves within this whole conversation of medical devices?
Well, I'm working on a book, so I hope to have that out in maybe a year or two. I think I'm going to call it Hip Check. Not sure, but I'm a hockey mom, so I love that. But then also, I have a Substack, Frances Scott. I think it's Frances Scott 007 on Substack. And then I have a YouTube channel, Frances Scott. And I have Instagram is at ATX_FS for Frances Scott. So, I'm a very social person. So when I lost my career as a news anchor, I went to social media, and then I still get some of the back and forth that I love so much about working on TV. I still get it through social media. So I'm pretty much everywhere.
Well, thank you so much for being here. For those of you listening, please reach out to Frances if you have any questions or concerns about medical devices of your own causing issues. I know that that's what I'm going to do for my own family, because I do find that this is such an important topic that has really been widely eliminated from the public square, from public conversation. So thank you so much, Frances, for what you're doing to spread awareness. We appreciate you. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time. Take care.